At this point, you should have some familiarity with ordered solids, closest packed solids, and their unit cells. Now let's see how these are expressed when we think about ionic solids. Our learning goals are going to be to look for the similarities and differences between our metallic solids, which are the earlier variety that we've been looking at, and ionic solids. We're also going to be interested in how the unit cells can express the empirical formulas of ionic solids and what sort of considerations must go into forming those. Ionic solids are basically the ordered solids that come from ionic compounds. And you'll recall that ionic compounds are simply ions that are held together by electrostatic forces. That is the charge-charge attraction that comes from Coulomb's law. Opposite charges attract and like charges repel. We have ions of all kinds, so that means the structure of the lattice is going to be a balance between the attractive forces on the one hand and the repulsive forces on the other. The crystal structure of ions is going to be influenced by several factors. One of these is the amount of charge that's on each of these. Remember, sometimes we have two ions that have the same magnitude charge, like sodium chloride, sodium +1, chloride -1. But sometimes we have ionic substances where one of them has a different magnitude charge. So for example, magnesium chloride would be Mg+2, forming a compound with Cl-. So there would need to be twice as many chloride ions as there are magnesium ions. So this is part of what forms that consideration. We also need to worry about the size, the relative size of the two ions. Typically, we'll find that negative ions are larger than positive ions, but that's not always true either. The relative size will dictate something about the structure of these solids. We'll also be interested in the coordination number, that is to say the number of nearest neighbors around each ion, because that plays a role with the empirical formula that's created by this lattice and the structure of the lattice itself. So let's first talk about ionic charge and size. As I mentioned, negative ions typically are larger than positive ions, and so they're the ones that occupy the actual lattice sites in the close packed structure. That means the positive ions, which are smaller, fill the interstitial site. So let's take a look at what it means to fill an interstitial site. And we're actually going to want the cations to be a little bit larger than the interstitial site available so that they push the anions apart from one another. So here are three anions in red and a cation in blue, and we're going to add a fourth anion on top to form a tetrahedral site. In this case, we want the cation to be large enough so that it pushes those anions a little bit apart, so it's actually going to be larger than 0.225 of the radius of the anions. When we look at an octahedral site, so this is got 5 of the atoms in the octahedral site, we'll add a sixth one on top. The cation in the middle must be a little bit larger than the size of that interstitial octahedral site, so it's going to be larger than 0.414 of the radius of the negative ions. So here we are showing that the negative ions are actually pushed a little bit apart. That leads to a little bit more stable structure because there are repulsive forces between them. Finally, we'll look at a body-centered cubic instance, and this is where we're going to have 8 nearest neighbors around a cation in the middle. And so the cubic site is actually got a size of 0.732, the interstitial site. So the positive ion in the middle has to be larger than that proportion of the radius of the anions. Now let's see how this works with face-centered crystal lattices. And we're going to focus mostly on face-centered cubic lattices, although you should be aware that all of the others are also observed in these various ionic compounds. So this is the basic structure of a face-centered cubic lattice. It has a coordination number of 12 for each of these lattice sites, but that does not include the opposite ion, for example, so we could get different things. Both octahedral and tetrahedral sites are available for the counterion. Remember when we formed the hexagonal closest packed layers to get the close packed structure, it had both octahedral and tetrahedral sites. And so those are both present in this face-centered cubic because it is a product of that hexagonal closest packed layers. So let's first look at the octahedral sites and face-centered cubic lattices. Now, as I talk, I'm going to assume that the negative ions are located at the lattice sites and the interstitial sites are being filled by the positive ions. But you should be aware that if the sizes of those ions are different, that it could be the opposite arrangement that occurs in an actual ionic compound. So the larger of the two ions is going to occupy the lattice sites. What happens when the smaller fits into the octahedral interstitial site? So let's draw a face-centered cubic unit cell. Here it is. And let's put in a microgrid inside that unit cell. So the octahedral site in the center of that cell is going to be where the smaller of the two ions goes. Now let's blow that up a little bit and we can make a clearer to read picture of that octahedral site. And we can see that the ion that's in the middle there is going to be surrounded by 6 ions of the opposite charge. All right, so it's important to know that the nearest neighbors for that ion are really, it's going to have a nearest neighbor or a coordination number of 6 when it comes to the ions of the opposite charge. An example of this is sodium chloride. So here's a picture of the sodium chloride lattice. You can see that at the lattice sites for the face-centered cubic lattice are all the chloride ions. They're the larger of the two. And the others, the green, are the sodium ions that are part of this sodium chloride lattice. Now, we've got a sodium ion in the very middle of the cube, in the very middle of the unit cell, so it is occupying an octahedral site. Its nearest neighbors are 6 chloride ions located in each of the faces of this cube. Now, we also have lattice sites for sodium on midway up the edge of each of these edges in the cube, and they also will have 6 nearest neighbors of chloride in the extended lattice. So we can see that the general structure of sodium chloride is actually a very simple structure. It's a very cubic-like structure with atoms at all the cubic sites that you can locate within this extended lattice structure. Coordination number, as I said, is 6. Now, what about tetrahedral sites in face-centered cubic lattices? So again, we're going to put the larger of the two atoms, or two ions, at the lattice sites, and the smaller one at the tetrahedral sites. So here again is our face-centered cubic unit cell, and we once again put the grid in here. Now, where are the tetrahedral sites in here? Well, they're actually at the center of each of the smaller cubes written inside this unit cell. So here is one of them, and we place an ion in the center of that smaller cube, and that's a tetrahedral interstitial site. Let's blow that up. And now we can see that the nearest neighbors for the ion in that interstitial tetrahedral site, there's 4 of them. Okay, this is what defines a tetrahedral interstitial site. So an example of this might be calcium fluoride. Here is a picture of the unit cell for calcium fluoride. And the fluorides are all colored yellow here, whereas the calciums are colored white or gray. We can see that the calciums are located at the lattice sites, at the corners of the cube, and in the faces of the cube. And the fluorides are all located in the tetrahedral site. So you notice as you look at this, look carefully, each of the fluoride ions is at the center of one of the little boxes inside the big cubic box. The big cubic box contains 8 of those smaller cubes, and there are 8 of those fluoride ions in there in each of those smaller boxes. So the coordination number is 4 for these tetrahedral sites. So we have 4 calcium ions per FCC unit cell. Remember, that was the number of atoms that we found in a face-centered cubic unit cell. And 8 tetrahedral sites, and each of them is occupied by a fluoride ion. So the net empirical formula is that we have twice as many fluorides as we have calcium. So here's an example where the relative charges on the two ions dictates to us how many of those tetrahedral sites must be filled. If it turned out that this should appear in a 1-to-1 ratio, it would turn out that only half of the tetrahedral interstitial sites would be filled by the ion of the opposite charge. So in this way, the relative charges of those ions really do dictate what kind of ionic structure, what kind of solid structure it has in the ordered array.